James Mason, an elderly black man, never imagined his quiet walk home would land him in handcuffs, victimized by a system that saw him as guilty before he even spoke. That night, he'd be caught in a storm of racism, and his millionaire son had no idea. What happened next will shock even the most seasoned veterans of injustice. But let's start from the beginning. In the dimly lit streets of the city, where the soft yellow glow from the street lamps did little to fight the thick blanket of darkness, James Mason moved with the slow, measured pace of someone who had seen much in his 70-odd years. His clothes were faded and frayed at the edges, bearing the signs of hard work and long years. His skin, a deep shade of brown, held the wear of a lifetime filled with struggles, both visible and invisible. The lines etched into his face told stories of hardships faced, of racism endured, and of battles fought with both the system and the world around him. His hands, calloused from decades of labor, gently gripped a small brown bag filled with groceries he had just purchased from the corner store. The simple act of buying food should have been nothing more than a mundane errand. But for James, it was another reminder of the routine life he had built, one of quiet dignity in a world that often didn't recognize his worth. He walked alone, his mind distant, filled with the weight of memories from decades of living as a black man in a country that rarely looked beyond his skin. The streets were eerily quiet, the sound of his footsteps the only rhythm in the night. That was, until the harsh screech of tires cut through the silence. A police car, its headlights cutting through the darkness, came to a sudden stop in front of him. A young officer, his expression unreadable, stepped out and immediately locked eyes with James. He didn't offer a greeting or a smile. His eyes were calculating, sizing James up with a dismissive glance. "Hey, old man, come here," the officer barked, his voice sharp, carrying an authority that demanded compliance. James stopped in his tracks, his calmness faltering slightly as a knot tightened in his chest. His heart rate quickened, but his face remained composed. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady, though tinged with suspicion. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he snapped, "Don't play games with me. You're carrying something you shouldn't be. Hand it over." James blinked in confusion. What could he possibly be carrying? His mind quickly assessed the contents of the grocery bag. Nothing more than basic food items. Before he could protest or clarify, the officer grabbed his arm, roughly pulling him toward the patrol car. James, now understanding the situation all too well, said nothing. He'd seen this before. Police assuming guilt based on his appearance, his age, his race. With a swift motion, the officer slapped the cuffs on him, his actions cold and impersonal. As James's thoughts flashed back to all the times he had been harassed, profiled, and humiliated, he swallowed the anger rising in his chest. This battle, he knew, wasn't one that could be won with words alone. The officer's grip was firm as he led James toward the patrol car. People walking by paused, watching the scene unfold, some shaking their heads, others averting their eyes. James could feel their stares, the judgment in their silence. The officer pushed him into the back seat, slamming the door harder than necessary. Inside the car, James sat motionless, his mind racing. He had lived long enough to know how quickly things could escalate. He thought of his son, Charles, who had recently made a name for himself in the tech industry. Charles had worked hard to rise above the struggles James had known in his youth. James could only imagine what his son would think if he knew what was happening right now. But Charles was miles away, focused on his growing empire, far removed from the daily hardships his father faced. As the patrol car sped through the streets, James's thoughts were interrupted by the officer's voice over the radio, calling in the arrest. The officer was still making assumptions, still accusing him of something he hadn't done. "Got an old black man here. Looks like he's up to no good. I need backup," the officer said, clearly convinced of James's guilt before even checking his story. James stayed silent, his fists clenched in his lap. This wasn't the first time he'd been targeted like this, but something inside him had changed. He wasn't just an old man now. He was a symbol of everything wrong with a system that criminalized him for simply existing. James was taken to the precinct, where they shoved him into a holding cell. It was cold and dimly lit, the concrete walls pressing in on him. He sat on the bench, exhausted, his thoughts spinning in the dark. He was just trying to go home, but now he was trapped in the grip of a system that didn't see him as a human being, but as a threat. But fate had other plans. In the midst of the confusion, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He hadn't even realized it was still there. It was a text from his son, Charles. "Dad, something's up. Are you okay?" James's heart skipped a beat. Charles had a sixth sense when it came to trouble. He didn't know the specifics, but something must have tipped him off. James's hands trembled slightly as he typed back, telling Charles what had happened. Within minutes, Charles was on the phone with his father's lawyer, pulling strings that James didn't even know existed. The old man didn't know how Charles had managed to become so powerful, but he sure as hell was grateful. The officer, still standing outside the cell, was completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. As Charles's name flashed on his screen, the officer answered, not expecting what was coming. This is Officer Henderson. I have an elderly man in custody." "Yeah. You know what? Never mind. Charles didn't give him the chance to finish. "Listen, officer." Charles's voice was sharp, commanding. "My name is Charles Mason. You have my father in custody right now for no reason. I want him released immediately, and if I don't see him walking out of that station in the next 15 minutes, I will make sure your department understands just how far this will go." The officer stammered, suddenly realizing just how much he had underestimated the man he had just arrested. Less than an hour later, James was released. The officer, now looking uncomfortably aware of his mistake, opened the cell door and allowed James to walk out. His head was held high, but inside he was seething. The small victory felt hollow, the weight of the humiliation still heavy on his shoulders. As James stepped into the bright lights of the parking lot, Charles's sleek black car was waiting for him. His son was leaning against it, arms crossed, his expression a mix of concern and anger. "You okay, Pops?" Charles asked as he approached. James didn't answer immediately. He looked at his son, at the man he'd become, and felt a strange pride mixed with a deep sadness. Charles had fought to escape this world, but no matter how high he rose, it was still a place that saw his father as less than human. "I'm fine," James said finally, his voice steady. "But this needs to change, Charles." Charles nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, Dad, and I promise, we're going to make sure it does." The world outside was waiting for them. But for the first time in years, James felt like he wasn't alone in the fight anymore. His son was right beside him, and together, they would bring the fight to the doorsteps of a system that had failed them both. And this time, they weren't backing down. As they drove off, the city lights blurred behind them, but James knew one thing for sure. His story wasn't over yet.